Started this webinar. The recording is running. My name is Marjan Grootveld, and like the other host, Irina Kuchma, I'm involved in EUDAT and OpenAIRE. We will be recording the webinar and send you a link to the recording and the slides later this week. OpenAIRE is an Horizon 2020 project that supports the European Commission's mandate and ambitions for open science, open access, and open data. Now, open data as such may not be very valuable. It requires data management and a bit of documentation to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and ultimately reusable. That is, to make the data fair. EUDAT is another Horizon 2020 project. Its vision is to enable European researchers and practitioners from any research discipline to preserve, find, access and process data in a trustworthy environment. Trust is of the essence, therefore, and certification is an instrument to inspire trust. We have two presenters today. Peter Doorn is Director of DANS and Ingrid Dillo is Deputy Director. I guess one of the presenters now has his mic open. Can you please switch it off? There's too much noise. Thank you. DANS, Data Archiving and Networked Services, is an institute of the Royal Netherlands Academy for Arts and Sciences and the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. DANS offers a research repository which has 3 certifications for being trustworthy. Thanks to the efforts of both speakers and the international data-related networks and research infrastructures each of them participates in. Ingrid is also one of the authors of the scientific data publication called The FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. Before I hand over to Ingrid, I have a few housekeeping messages. Your accounts are muted, so we can't hear you as attendants, but you can use the chat box when you have questions or comments. Please start any question you have with the word question. At the end of the presentation, Ingrid and Peter will try to answer your questions. When we share recordings and slides later on, you will also find a link to a short evaluation form. We hope to receive a lot of feedback from you. I hope you will enjoy the webinar. Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marjan. Can you hear me? Great. So welcome again to all of you, and I would like to start by saying that Peter and I are very pleased to be able to speak to you this morning. Before we start with the heart of the matter, I would like to spend a few words on our institution DANS for those of you who do not know us yet. DANS has a mission to promote permanent access to digital research data. So we are a data service provider. Our roots are in the social sciences and humanities, but over the last years we have been spreading our wings and we are now also serving other domains, for example like the life sciences. We have a certified long-term archive called EASY that holds over 32,000 datasets. Another service is called NARCIS. NARCIS is the national metadata portal to scientific information in the Netherlands. It holds publications, datasets, and information on research institutions, researchers, and research projects in our country. We also host the Dutch Dataverse. That's being used by the majority of universities here and also a number of other institutions and is aimed at short and medium-term storage of data. Finally, we offer training and consultancy services in the areas of research data management, digital curation, and certification of repositories. Now let's turn to the subject of this morning. Peter and I would like to introduce to you 2 existing sets of criteria. First of all, the core requirements for assessing the quality of data repositories. And secondly, the FAIR principles to determine the quality of data sets. Based on that observation, we will present a possible way of operationalizing the FAIR principles in trustworthy data repositories. Now, this webinar is going to be a real duet. I will start off with the requirements for repositories and then Peter will talk about FAIR and our suggested operationalization. I will try to wrap it all up at the end. And finally, I would like to stress that we have taken the initiative for this webinar not only to inform you about our ideas, but even more to get your thoughts and feedback. So do not hesitate to tell us what you think during the Q&A or via email later on. And where do I do that? I'm very sorry, but I need to put down my volume I hear. So I will do that. Adjust volume. Go now. Okay, we continue. Sorry about that. So I have the next slide up, I think. Yes, I do. So DANS was founded in 2005, and we built on a number of predecessors. And when we started off, based on our mission, we were asked by our funders to design a set of guidelines to measure the quality of our own repository as well as others. And this initial set would become known as the Data Seal of Approval. We started off by designing 5 basic principles that lay the foundation for the actual 16 Data Seal of Approval guidelines. After a couple of years, we handed over this standard, this set of guidelines, to the international community because we believe that that would enhance the impact of the Data Seal of Approval. So as of 2009, the Data Seal of Approval was governed by an international board. And at the moment, over 60 seals have been acquired around the globe, but with a focus on Europe. So now about the certification landscape. Over the last decade or so, not only the DSA emerged, but a number of certification standards for data repositories were defined. And on this slide, you see them in a tiered pyramid-like framework. At the top, you see the ISO 16363. That's the most elaborate standard that is available at the moment for repositories, and it's a formal certification. The standard contains over 100 metrics that you need to comply with, and it involves a formal external audit. Just below, there is the Nestor seal that has been developed in Germany. It offers the possibility for an extended certification based on only 34 criteria, so already a lot less. And at the base of the pyramid, we see the core level certification, and there we find the Data Seal of Approval, but also the certification mechanism that is used by the ICSU World Data System to assess their so-called regular members, which are usually repositories. So there are 2 different standards at the base of this pyramid, and these 2 standards have a lot in common. They are both lightweight standards with a limited number of guidelines, and they are both based on a self-assessment that is then by the repository, that is then peer-reviewed by the community. There is also a lot of complementarity. The Data Seal of Approval is particularly strong in Europe, whereas the WDS has a lot of members in other parts of the world. And secondly, the DSA started off in the social sciences and humanities, where the roots of DANS are, so it has a strong focus still on these domains, while WDS is very strong in the earth and space sciences. So, based on these similarities and complementarity, it seemed only logical to investigate whether the 2 communities could collaborate. We formed a working group under the umbrella of the International Research Data Alliance, and in that context we worked for almost 2 years on the alignment of our catalogues of criteria for core certification. And with this initiative we wanted to reach a number of goals. We wanted to realize efficiencies and simplify the world of assessment options on the one hand, and on the other hand we wanted to stimulate more certifications and increase the impact on the community. All of this work resulted in a number of outcomes. We defined a new catalog of requirements based, you could say, on the best of both worlds, both DSA and WDS. We designed a common procedure for the assessment, and we also set up a shared testbed for assessment. And in that testbed, we ran 6 repositories as guinea pigs through the new requirements. So let's have a closer look at these new requirements. The body of the catalog is formed by 16 requirements that focus on organizational infrastructure, on digital object management, and on technology. Next to that, a repository is asked in its self-assessment to give some information on its context that concerns designated communities, things like types of data repositories, etc. And there is also the possibility to give additional information that you want to present and also give feedback as an applicant on the requirements themselves, because they also are a living thing, you can imagine, that need revision every number of years. What I want to do now is have a quick look at the 16 requirements. Of course, we do not have the time to go deep into them, but I think it would be nice to give you an impression. So here you see the first 6 ones that deal with the organizational infrastructure. And they are about, for example, the mission of the repository, on licensing and continuity planning, the fact that data should be used in accordance with disciplinary and ethical norms, the availability of adequate funding and qualified staff, and the level of expert guidance and feedback that the repository gets. If we look at the digital object management, then there are 8 requirements that deal with this aspect. And these involve the integrity and authenticity of the data holdings, the fact that the data and metadata should be relevant and understandable for the designated communities that the repository serves, the availability of documented processes and procedures in the archive, and of course the long-term responsibility that the repository takes and organizes for the data holdings. And then here you see the digital object management requirements continuing with the technical quality of data and metadata, the definition of workflows in the archive, of course the use of persistent identifiers and data citation, and finally the reuse of data over time. Then there are also 2 requirements dealing with the technical infrastructure. And this concerns the operating systems and the hardware and software technologies that are used by the repository, and also security issues. And they not only deal with the technology, but they also look at, for example, the facility of the repository itself and the users of the repository. So this requirement goes a little bit beyond the technical infrastructure. To give you an impression of what this catalog looks like, here you see one of the pages. It's the page that deals with the requirements regarding integrity and authenticity of the data. The requirements, as you can see, are always accompanied by a guidance text that provides more context and also suggests a number of questions that one could answer in the context of this requirement. Usually also suggestions for relevant evidence are given, and also cross-links with other criteria are identified. So this as an example to show you that there is a lot of information available to help you on your way in answering the questions complying with requirements in the catalog. These new requirements have just been published 1 or 2 weeks ago, and here you see the announcement of that on the RDA website, and below you see 2 links that lead you to all the material behind this, so anyone who's interested can go there. Now I would like to go back again to 2005, the starting point of DANS and also the starting point of the Data Seal of Approval. I told you that the Data Seal of Approval was based on 5 principles, and these 5 principles also form, I think, the basis of the new core level requirements that we have, that we are working with now. These principles state, and you see them here on the screen, that data can be found on the internet, that they should be accessible, there should be clear rights and licenses, that the data should be in a usable format, that they should be reliable, and that they should be identified in a unique and persistent way so that they can be referred to. Now, please keep these 5 principles in mind as I hand over the microphone to Peter to talk to you about FAIR.
Thank you, Ingrid. First of all, I'd like to know whether the audience can hear me well. I see a couple of yeses appear, so I guess that will be fine then. So we just had a look at the principles underlying the Data Seal of Approval. Now, probably many of you know that in 2014, it was on an occasion of a workshop in Leiden, a minimal set of community-agreed guiding principles were designed to make data more easily discoverable, accessible, appropriately integrated and reusable, and adequately citable. That became known as the FAIR data principles. To summarize what the FAIR principles stand for, or rather what the 4 individual letters of FAIR stand for, probably you all know them already. And if you hear them, you will already see quite a similarity with the Data Seal of Approval principles. The first one is findable. Data should be easy to find by both humans and computer systems and based on mandatory description of the metadata that allow the discovery of interesting data sets. They should be accessible, stored for long term, so that they can be easily accessed and or downloaded with well-defined license and access conditions, with open access when possible, whether at the level of metadata or at the level of the actual data content. Data should be interoperable, ready to be combined with other datasets by humans as well as computer systems. And they should be reusable, ready to be used for future research and to be processed further using computational methods. If you want to know more about the background of the FAIR data principles, recently an article was published in Nature Scientific Data. Ingrid contributed to that article, and you find a reference to that article here. Almost immediately after the FAIR principles were defined, they became popular, perhaps of a very good marketing, but perhaps also of the very well-chosen acronym FAIR, because who doesn't want to be fair? But also because the principles have an immediate appeal. And in a way, I'm of course a little bit jealous that we with the Data Seal of Approval did not come up with such a good acronym. What did not happen right at the outset was to look into how the FAIR data principles could be implemented. So that only happened later on. And in the meantime, actually, I think across the globe, several groups are working on implementing and operationalizing the FAIR data principles. But more or less the original group, and under the also under the umbrella of the Research Data Alliance and the Force 11 group, are working on an implementation. And you find links to this work here. But there is different implementations going on, I think, also for different aims. You can see an implementation that is more focusing on the creation of data. For instance, Horizon 2020, the European program, in its latest requirements, calls those requirements on fair data management, fair research data management. Another kind of implementation is more to assess data that is already there, to establish the FAIR profile of existing data. And that will be the main subject of what I will be talking on later on. And then there is also the development of FAIR data technologies, working on transformation tools to make data fair, which is another kind of implementation again. I want, before I go into my main subject of fair data assessment, to spend a few words on the first one of the requirements of fair data management plans for when data is being created in new projects. Because recently this summer, new Horizon 2020 guidelines on fair data management came out. And there is a specific section on fair data, and I summarize that section here. And actually they provide guidance by formulating questions that researchers could or should, this is not entirely clear, answer. And there is a total of 5 questions on making data findable, 10 questions on making data openly accessible as it is formulated, 4 questions on making data interoperable, and 4 questions on increasing data reuse through clarifying licenses, it says there. And then there is a couple of additional sections with more questions. And it results in a total of, I counted them, 39 questions. And I must say that I'm afraid this may result in some problems for researchers not knowing exactly what to do, or perhaps they feel that they are wrapped in red tape and that those requirements may turn into a paper tiger or another hoop to jump through. I think that if we are looking into operationalizations and implementations of fair data, we should also aim at making them very simple and straightforward. If we want to assess repositories, there is a couple of hundreds of them across the world, perhaps a couple of thousand. But in terms of datasets, there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of datasets. And if we want to assess them, it should be done in a bit easy and relatively quick way. It should be possible to do that. Now let us compare the DSA principles and the FAIR principles. You heard from Ingrid the 5 DSA principles and look at the similarity. Data can be found, findable, data are accessible, data are in a usable format. Well, that is not exactly the same as interoperable, but you could say that a usable format is really an important aspect of interoperability. The DSA talks about data being reliable, the FAIR principles of reusable, and reliability, I would say, is a condition for reuse, rather than that it is the same. So the 2 principles are not really the same, but they are very comparable. By the way, the DSA also contained this important principle that data, it should be possible to refer to the data by means of an identifier. The FAIR principles also find this very important, and if you look also in the original documents of the discussion, then this citability is a very important aspect, but it is included under Findable. Of course, the acronym wouldn't be so nice if you also would have to have a C for citable. Now, what we propose is actually to combine in the operationalization of the FAIR principles, to combine them with the data seal of approval. There is a growing demand for quality criteria for research data sets and a way to assess their fitness for use. By combining them, we have the great possibility of having both criteria for the quality of a repository by means of the DSA and criteria for data quality by means of FAIR. So our attempt is to operationalize the principles to make them easily implementable in any trustworthy digital repository. And our exercise isn't over yet. We're working on it. but we found it very important to give this webinar and other presentations right now to get your feedback, because we know that we are not the only ones thinking about how to operationalize FAIR. How could it work in our view? Well, we would like to consider the F, the A, and the I as separate dimensions of data quality. And we would like to eliminate as far as possible interaction effects among the dimensions, because they complicate scoring. And so do elements that occur under different FAIR dimensions, because scoring is actually what we are after in a kind of a star system. So we would like to score data sets on each of the dimensions. And as I will show later on, originally we also thought to operationalize the reusability, but we had great difficulties doing that. And therefore we concluded it would be better to consider reusability as the resultant of the other three. And we claim that if a data set is both findable, accessible, and interoperable, then it is by definition reusable. Moreover, we would like to make the scoring as automatic as possible. Although not all principles can be established objectively, we think it can be done to a certain degree, and I will show you later on. We would like to make it possible to score at the ingest of a data set by a data specialist of a trusted data repository, but also make it possible to score the fairness of a data set by data users, by allowing or creating the possibility for community reviews. Okay, let us look at two imaginary examples. We would like to give every dataset ultimately a FAIR profile. And in this example, dataset X has the FAIR profile of findability 4, accessibility 3, interoperability 2, and that would result in a reusability of 3, which is actually the simple arithmetic average of the 3. I will show you a bit later on what this means, because of course we've worked at how to operationalize the 4 letters, the 3 letters actually. For instance, a good findability would mean that there is a persistent identifier, but also sufficient metadata to understand what the dataset is about. And an accessibility of 3 would mean accessible with some restrictions, and an interoperability of 2, of course, would mean that the interoperability is not that good. I will show you in the next slides what we mean by that. We already got some remarks on our first idea of visualizing this, as you saw in the previous slides, and we are experimenting with other alternatives as well, and some people even have suggested alternative visualizations, for which we are very grateful. If you have better ideas, please send them to us. Now, operationalizing the F of Findable. How do we think we could do that? Well, Findable is, I think, by definition defined by the metadata, the documentation. And as we saw that citability in the FAIR principles is understood under Findable as well, also the identifier should be under F. And we try to come up with a ranking there, with the lowest score of 1 being that a dataset just exists somewhere on the web, but it has no persistent identifier and no metadata or documentation to explain what it is about. A score of 2 would mean that there is a persistent identifier, but without or with insufficient metadata. What insufficient and sufficient mean is partly subjective. It should be enough to understand what the data is about. That is what sufficient would mean, and insufficient would mean, of course, not enough metadata to understand what the data is about. A score of 3 would mean that there is sufficient metadata, but without a persistent identifier. We should not forget that this is the situation at the moment still in quite a few repositories, where there is some way of identifying datasets, but those repositories do not formally use a persistent identification method. Nevertheless, they curate and care such data repositories curate and care for their data. That kind of an assessment is not part of FAIR itself. It can be done in the data seal of approval. It is part of the assessment of the repository, not of the data set. A score of 4 would mean there is a persistent identifier with sufficient metadata, and this sufficient includes information on data provenance. We think that without good information on data provenance, it is very hard to reuse the data. And here you see, indeed, provenance was, in the original understanding of the FAIR principles, understood as very vital in reusability. But because we do not operationalize reusability separately, but do it under F, under Findable, we included provenance here. And we think this is good because the provenance is usually part of the metadata. It is described in the metadata, and therefore it fits very well in the Findable. And finally, the maximum score would mean that there is a persistent identifier, rich metadata and additional documentation, and especially explanation of how the data can be used. Currently, we are working on further explanation in more detail and with examples and support for FAIR data assessors and reviewers. So this is not ready yet, but we would offer further guidance of how to turn those 5 criteria into practice. Over to the A of accessible. Accessible defined by the presence of a user license. Again, some people, also the Horizon 2020 guidelines, put the license under the R of reusable. I think it is better under the A of accessible because licenses have to do with licenses to access of the data. Of course, for reuse, but those licenses fit very well here. And we think that it is, again, fairly easy to grade this principle by having a 1 for no user license at all. I'm not going through the whole list now, but the highest would be full open access, unrestricted, CC0, perhaps also CC BY. It is important to know that we think that when user restrictions apply of any kind, the accessibility is of course limited. And some people have claimed that open access could be better considered as a separate issue altogether, not to include them in FAIR at all. But I think that if there is such a grading, then full open access is simply the highest level of accessibility that exists, and therefore a dataset could get 5 stars. Some people also think it would not be fair in another sense than the FAIR principles, if a dataset that, for instance, contains personal data and therefore needs to be privacy protected, can, as a maximum, only get an accessibility of 3. But I think from the user perspective, it is important that the user will be able to see how accessible a dataset is immediately in a repository. And he will not care whether that is for some other reason or not. He just would like to know whether the data is immediately accessible or not. And the same will hold true for when it is a computer process, an automatic process that wants to access the data. Then still you have to know that a restriction applies. Operationalizing the I is actually very similar to what Tim Berners-Lee came up with when he presented his open data plan. It is slightly modified here because some aspects are already covered by findability and accessibility. And we also think that we limit ourselves here always to data that is available on the web. And the first star in Tim Berners-Lee's system is that data are on the web in whatever form. So as I said, we first attempted to operationalize the R as well, but we changed our mind. So we could ask ourselves, is it a separate dimension? We think one of the problems is that reusability always will be partly subjective, because it will depend on what you want to use the data for. That will define at least, well, and probably even a substantial part of the reusability. So we had a couple of ideas, and also others had a couple of ideas for operationalization, but we, in the end, rejected them. First was a clear provenance. One idea was to put the provenance of data under reusability, but that is already an aspect of F. Actually, I made a mistake there. It should say F4 and not F5. Second, data is in a trusted digital repository, because unsustained data will not remain usable. Well, this is not a characteristic of the dataset itself. It is a characteristic of a repository where the data is kept. So therefore, this is covered by the data seal of approval and doesn't need to be covered by the FAIR principles. Explication on how data was or can be used is available. Again, is an aspect of F. In this case, it is F5. Whether data can be automatically used by machines is an aspect of interoperability. If interoperability level 4 or 5 is reached, then we think the access by machines can indeed be automatic. And finally, whether data is reliable or replicable, as is also sometimes demanded. We think this is a difficult one because this can only be known after reanalysis. Of course, here community reviews could be the answer, but it would be very hard to say something on the data on the outset. Oops. Yeah. Ideally, we would like to present of each and every data set in a trusted repository what the FAIR profile is, so that a user can immediately see how good the metadata is, how accessible the data is, how interoperable the data is, and whether and the average score of the R as well. This is just a mock-up, in this case in EASY, but you could also realize the same in Zenodo, in Dataverse, in Mendeley Data, in Figshare, in B2Safe, or in any repository that is compliant with the data seal of approval, in the way I indicate here. These are just mock-ups. This hasn't been realized yet. Well, how could we do this? And this is an idea for a future project we want to carry out in 2017. We want to set up an independent website, much like the data seal of approval website, to which repositories will link, because we will offer there a FAIR data assessment tool. The website will provide such an assessment tool, like a questionnaire with explanation and examples for each criterion that both data specialists working in repositories and data users, when they review a dataset, can use to give their assessment of the fairness of a dataset. The online database will contain information on the repository holding the dataset, the identifier, because it should link back, of course, to that repository, and perhaps also some basic metadata such as the name of the dataset, information about the reviewers. The idea should be, it should be possible to withhold the ID of the reviewer, because anonymous review should also be possible, and of every dataset, the FAIR profile and scores. And finally, it should offer analytics of FAIR profiles. How many datasets comply with the FAIR criteria and in what way? Finally, can the FAIR data assessment be automatic? We try to summarize the 15 FAIR data criteria here in this table and give our idea whether that can be done in an automatic way or not. And indeed, about half of the criteria could be scored automatically, but the other half we think is at least partly subjective, and therefore also cannot be fully automatized. It is easy to see, for instance, whether a dataset has a PID and whether there is metadata, but what the quality of that metadata is less easy to establish automatically. And concerning the interoperability, that to a large degree depends on the availability of lists of lists of formats, whether such formats are proprietary, accepted, or archival. And the two highest scores for interoperability have to do with harmonization and linkage, and that would depend on domain vocabularies and on semantic methods used when the data is linked. That is where I end my part of the presentation, and I would like to hand over again to Ingrid to wrap up and give you the main takeaways.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I'll try to sum it up a little bit. Here you see the main takeaways on the slide. The core certification principles and the FAIR principles together form a good starting point for quality assessment of data and repositories. And we hope we've shown how we intend to operationalize these principles in our own long-term repository easy. We suggest a scoring mechanism to assess the fairness of datasets. This means scoring the F, the A, and the I as separate dimensions of data quality, and we consider, as you've seen, the R, the reusability of a dataset, as the resultant of the other three. The scoring should, of course, be done in an automated way as much as possible, but some aspects will probably remain subjective. And there we suggest scoring by both data archivists as well as the reusers of the data, and maybe even the creators of the data. Now, I've seen during our talk that there has been a lively debate already on the chat, so that's very nice to see. We deliberately tried to keep our first steps in this direction simple and create a starting point. And we believe that this FAIR scoring mechanism is implementable in any repository, but ideally, of course, all certified trustworthy data repositories should in future assess the level of fairness of the data that they hold. No, I'll wait here and until we have the discussion before I go into this deeper. So, finally, we want to point you to 3 workshops on related topics that will be organized at the IDCC next February in Edinburgh. These workshops deal with how EUDAT services could support FAIR data. There is one on OpenAIRE services and tools for open research data in Horizon 2020, and one on the Dutch training course Essentials for Data Support. And with this, we have come to the end of this webinar talk. Before we stop, we would like to thank a number of people for their valuable contributions. Jamie Shears from CERN, and our Dutch colleagues Patrick Aerts, Laurens Seensink, whom I already saw in the chat box, and Emily Thomas. So thank you all very much for listening, and I guess we now go back to Marjan for the Q&A session.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll drop out immediately. So Irina has collected all the questions from the chat box, and I guess a lot of discussion would be possible. There won't be time for that now, but it's a new idea presented by Peter and Ingrid. So the discussion can continue also in the workshops that were mentioned. Please, presenters, can you go through the questions that are now visible on screen?
I've tried to follow the questions a little bit during the talk, and I think there are a lot of questions about the R. There is a question about why do you make the R only the adding up of the F, the A, and the I. There are a lot of questions and comments about the R could also be reproducibility, relevance, responsibility, etc., etc. What I would like to say as a starting point is that we really focused on keeping this simple. Peter already explained why we chose to make the R the adding up of everything. We also believe that the reproducibility is something that can't be based on these more or less technical elements alone. There you also need to look at the relevance of the data, so you come in a completely different realm. Maybe Peter would like to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, replicability is something that is quite difficult. It has to do with the whole setup of the research. Perhaps even the problem is not so much in the data themselves. I mean, the data as they are. It could be that they are collected in the wrong way or measured in the wrong way. So with replicability or reproducibility, I think there is more involved than just the data set as they are. I see something happened in the order of the questions.
Yeah, what I also remember from what I saw passing by in the chat box is that a lot of people were concerned about the fact that in the model as it is now, it only 5 stars, a 5-star can only be given to in the area of accessibility to data sets that are completely open under CC0. People have the feeling that if you can only get, if you have a sensitive data set, you can never get any further than a 3-star, and that is simply not fair, because then you have a total number that says something about the data quality, and then you have the then it looks like the data is of poor quality, of lesser quality, but no one can help it because it's sensitive material. So that seems to be a kind of a hurdle here for the audience.
Yeah, perhaps it's like with hotels that 5 stars is normally the maximum, but there are some hotels in the Gulf states, I believe, where they even have 7-star hotels. But I don't know whether we should go there. I think we should build in simply a threshold. This is how people will look at the scores. But in terms of reuse, then simply a data set that is protected in any way is less accessible than a data set that is CC0, that has full that is in the public domain. So I would say that people should be very satisfied if their data is privacy protected and still accessible under certain conditions, so that it has 3 stars.
Okay. Which one are we going to take?
Shall we go just from the top?
Yeah, let's do that. The online database is, the catalog is a question that comes from Ron. This is about...
Oh, no, I see now. No, Maggie Hellstrom is on top of my list.
Okay, then I have another list.
She says, I've heard that some people talk about FAIR plus R, with the last R standing for... we
did that one.
Then Ron, indeed.
Yeah.
I still don't understand why R doesn't get its own score and you divide the score by 4. Because we weren't able to operationalize the R. That is the simple answer. If you can come up with a graded score for the R, we are very grateful and we will adapt the system, but we couldn't. And we gave it quite a bit of thinking. And as I said, this also implied that we moved some aspects that by some people are understood under the R to the F and the I and the A. Of course, to have like 15 criteria, so 3 times 5 is also less than having 4 times 5 is 20. And I still think the simpler the better.
Then there is a question about metadata being for the institutional repositories, which metadata has to be used. Well, I think there's no one rule there. That depends on the designated community that the repository serves, I would say. And we say that there should be enough metadata for the designated community to understand what the data is about. And this word enough is of course very subjective, because it differs from group to group, from discipline to discipline, but also from person to person. So I think there is not one answer here. It really depends on the area you're working in. And then there is talk about the OpenAIRE guidelines for data. They are not consistent with the guidelines. I'm not an expert in that area, so I'm afraid I can't answer the second part of the question. And you can't.
Me neither.
Probably either know.
But I think the guidelines that OpenAIRE specifies are limited actually only to the harvesting of repositories. They give guidelines of what the format in which repositories present their metadata so that OpenAIRE can harvest them. And they do not specify other criteria. That is what I know about that. Let us continue also with an eye on the time. The next one is about the scoring. When do you give a 5 for F, for instance? This calls for new criteria. I don't think so. Well, in a sense, our criteria are new criteria, but we specify there that the metadata should be rich, and additional documentation should be there. And it should give examples of how the data is or can be used. And of course, the provenance is already under F4. So the things add up, right? And when that is the case, then the findability is optimal. Of course, also provided that there is a persistent identifier, which is already covered under 2.
Then we have the question from Herbert. No PID and no metadata should be 0, not 1. Yeah, well, that's just the choice that we have made, and we want to be inclusive and nice, so we give everyone 1 star at the starting point.
Yeah, you can start counting. This is a never-ending debate whether you start scoring at 0 or start scoring at 1. We chose to start scoring at 1. Sue Cook. What about NC licenses? Data available without registration but limited reuses. NC, not Creative Commons. What are NC licenses?
Non-commercial, Marianne says. Non-commercial licenses.
NC is one of the attributes in the Creative Commons family, which means that those data cannot be used for commercial reasons or by commercial partners.
Right.
Okay. We just include them under a restriction of any kind. Doesn't matter which. Whether there is a restriction on commercial, non-commercial, whatever restriction there is, it means the data is not fully accessible. Yeah, if you look, you could go into much more detail. This holds true for every dimension, but then you get an enormous list of ratings, and I'm not sure whether you would serve the purpose by creating a lot of detail. The question is whether the data is accessible or not accessible or partially accessible. And a 5-star rating, I think, is enough to establish that.
Then we have a question coming from Ron about data with restrictions get a lower score. Well, we talked a little bit about that already. What I also see was a comment from Ross about his worry that we attach value of data quality on this schema. And I understand this worry. I think that what we are looking at here with these FAIR principles is more, let's say, the technical quality of the data. And there is a whole other aspect, namely the scientific quality of the data. And the technical quality might be perfect, but still, if it's based on crappy research, the scientific quality of the data set is not that well. So I think that is something that we need to bear in mind. Do you want to say anything more about this issue on restricted data getting a lower score? I think we had handled that, and that is the last one on my screen at last.
Pascal Aventurier, no, it goes on, there is more.
Oh, then I need to scroll.
From Indra. Says about findability. Is there a controlled list of different types of data? No, not that I know, but I would say if you mean data formats, I'm not quite sure what you mean by types of data here. So I'm also not sure how I can answer that question, and what you would want to use the controlled list of different types of data for, but I don't think it exists.
Then we get accessibility again, and we had that one that has to do with the sensitive data. Then there is a question coming from Maggie on the impact, if any, on the rating of a data set if there has been peer review or community review. Going back to what I just said about quality, I think that it would be great if we could add to these more or less technical elements of FAIR when we have a reuser review a data set, to if we could add a number of questions that are more looking at the scientific quality of the data. That would give another perspective on the matter.
What we propose to do, and I forgot to mention that while giving the presentation, is to have let us say, a final open question on the experiences of the data, like a more traditional kind of review where the user can just give his observations on the data or on the research as such. But we will treat that as qualitative information that also should be there, but that is not quantified. Then we can go over to Ron. Is that R is also the extent to which data connect to other data? Yeah, that was under interoperability in our operationalization. This is not technical, but on relevance. Yeah, I again think relevance depends on the purpose that you have. Whether a data set is relevant for your research or not depends on other things than on the formal FAIR principles. The FAIR principles just help you to assess whether the metadata is fine, whether it is accessible for you, and whether the data can be easily integrated with other data. And the relevance can only be, let us say, like I just said, can be entered in a qualitative assessment, but will differ from user to user.
I see we are almost there in time. Maybe Peter, you could say a little bit about the online database, the idea of that, and then I might say a little bit about RDA, which is at the bottom of the questions. Okay.
The online database will be like a catalog of all assessed data sets. So that is correct. You could consider it like that. And quickly, perhaps Lauren's question.
Mm-hmm.
Access, publication, research data, open science umbrella. Yeah, I think so. Could there be a relation between reusable and the openness of contextual information? Is there a link to open access publication and research data, the open science umbrella? Well, I'm not sure whether the FAIR criteria, the FAIR principles are not necessarily just about openness. Openness is then just one of the aspects which we understand under the A of accessibility again. And in this sense, there is a link to the open science agenda. But well, what we increasingly see is that there is becoming more stress on the total fairness than on just openness. Openness alone is not enough, is what I think is the current common opinion.
Right, then finally maybe about what we are planning to do at the RDA in, what is it, early April in Barcelona. Within the RDA, a new working group is starting up at the moment that looks at quality criteria for fitness, data fitness for use. We are involved in that working group, but we have deliberately said that we want to do this work independent of that working group in order to make quick progress, and also in order to try and run a kind of pilot project here within DANS. So that working group will definitely have a session in Barcelona. And it might be the case that we will also be presenting something in that group. So yes, there will be something in Barcelona in some way.
And I see we are 2 minutes over time now, but if you allow me 1 minute, I'll try to answer the remaining few questions. The question whether the F can be scored like in TripAdvisor, the answer is yes. The comments by Maggie on data requirements to be open, then anonymous review should not be allowed. Well, it is simply so that legally you cannot oblige people to present their personal details if they don't want to on the web, at least not in this country. Concerning the completeness of metadata and their quality, yes, you are right that there is not an automatic relation there, but in our experience, usually the fuller the metadata is, also the better it is. This is what we often see, at least at the DANS archive. And finally, Maggie's question, what the consequence could be for a repository if the data is consistently scoring very low. Well, I think you can imagine what will happen to that repository. It will not be regarded as a very important one. Perhaps something will happen, as is also happening with journals, that we will get some quality ranking or impact ranking of repositories if this exercise will be successful. But now we're 4 minutes over time, and I apologize for that. Nevertheless, I enjoyed this session a lot, and was very impressed by the many questions that you posed.
Yeah, and all the discussion in the chat also, so that was very valuable. Thank you all very much for that. And I think we now hand over to Marjan.
Thank you for that. I fully agree with your comments. It was an enjoyable webinar, I think, with a lot of discussion, and that discussion will certainly be continued. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Irina, at the other side, for hosting. Thank you all for participating. You will receive an email later this week with links to the slides and the recording. And don't hesitate to put your suggestions and questions in an email to the presenters. Thank you very much. We will end the recordings now.
Thank you all.